What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against his new rival, Alireza Firouzja, in a crazy chess.com Blitz game that just took place today on November 2nd, 2024. And I gotta say, this game was just out of this world. Now in the game, Magnus Carlsen opens 1e4, best by test, and Alireza Firouzja does go 1c5 to Sicilian Defense. Now from here we have knight to f3 and knight c6 on the board, and now instead of d4 heading for the open Sicilian, Magnus does play the move bishop b5. This is the Rossolimo Sicilian, and it is the most popular line in this position at the highest level. Now the idea behind this move is you are putting pressure on that knight on c6, you are threatening bishop takes c6, and beyond that you are setting up a very fast short castles followed by c3 and d4, gaining control of the center. Now here in this game, how is Alireza going to respond? Well, black has a wide variety of moves, but in this game, he does go e6, and this move is becoming more and more popular at the highest level. It is the top stockfish line, and the main idea is you want to go knight g to e7, supporting that knight on c6 with the other knight, and then go a6, driving back the bishop. However, in this game, Magnus Carlsen is having none of that. He does not allow that plan, and instead he takes on c6 immediately with the bishop. So, bishop takes c6 on the board, trading the bishop for the knight, and now black will have to damage his pawn structure to recapture. In the game, Alireza goes b takes c6. That is the best move. D takes c6 in this position just doesn't work out. So now from here, Magnus, d3, a standard idea in this position, and now Alireza knight e7. Now, queen c7 is becoming more popular at the highest level, but knight e7 also very good. Now, here in this position, what are the plans for both sides? Well, here, Magnus, believe it or not, he is abandoning his idea of going c3 and d4. Instead, he's going for a light squared strategy. He gives up his bishop on c6, that being the light squared bishop, and now he's putting all of his pawns on the light squares, and he is going to try and get counterplay against the black center. His plans may include b3 and bishop b2. It may include queen e2 and e5, clamping down on the center, and it also may include h4 to h5, gaining space on the king side in the spirit of alpha 0. Now, Alireza, on the other hand, his plans may include d6 or d5, getting a very nice pawn center in the middle of the board, and it may even include f6 and then e5, again further bolstering that center. Now, from here in this position, Magnus Carlsen does go b3, the idea being he wants to go bishop b2, putting pressure on this long diagonal with the bishop. Now, in response, Alireza, he plays a move that would make Ben Finegold himself blush. He actually goes f6, this being Ben Finegold's least favorite move on the chessboard. However, here in this position, it does work out. The idea being Magnus is trying to go bishop b2, therefore Alireza is going f6 and then e5, trying to take control of those dark squares in the center and blunting the bishop on b2. So f6, a very good move in response to b3 by Magnus. Alright, here, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing? Well, it turns out this move f6 does weaken the light squares on the king side, and there are two good ways to capitalize on that. One is knight to h4, the idea being if black goes e5, then your knight now has access to the f5 square. The other one being h4, the alpha 0 move, the idea being you're threatening h5 then h6, trying to make even more weaknesses on the king side. Now, instead of those plans here, Magnus Carlsen does play the very interesting idea e5. Now, this move is not quite as strong, and it does make it a lot easier for black to equalize, and the eval bar is dropping so much that the computer even thinks black is better here. Now, the best response here for black is going to be f takes e5, capturing that pawn on e5 immediately, and then after knight takes, following up with, say, d6 or d5. Instead of that here, Alireza does play the move knight g6, developing the knight, and now threatening f takes e5, which would win a pawn. However, this move is slightly dubious, and it does run into the alpha 0 idea of h4, gaining space on the king side, and that is what Magnus plays immediately in this game. So, h4, the threat now is h5, driving back the knight, and then maybe even h6 in the future, trying to create more and more weaknesses in the black camp. So what is Alireza going to do about it? Well, in the game, he actually goes h5, blocking the pawn immediately. However, this turns out to be a slightly dubious idea again by Alireza. Instead, you simply have to allow the pawn to advance further, perhaps going bishop e7 or any other developing move, allowing h5 if Magnus wants it. Instead, h5 on the board, and the problem with this move is the light squares on the king side are just incredibly weak. We can see after the move f6, the Ben Finegold signature move, that g6 square in particular is very, very vulnerable. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen in this position, how does he want to increase the pressure? Well, it turns out the best idea in this position is to just defend that pawn on e5. For example, bishop b2 supports the pawn, queen e2 supports the pawn. That way, if black takes on e5, then you can go knight takes e5 without losing a pawn. However, in this position, Magnus Carlsen, showing his flair, he simply gives up that pawn on e5. He wants to play a pawn sacrifice, and he does go knight b d2. Now, this move is not necessary. Again, you could simply go bishop b2 or queen e2, defending the pawn on e5. However, knight d2 on the board, giving up the pawn if Alireza wants it. Now, f takes e5 is a perfectly reasonable move. You can hang on to the pawn. For example, f takes bishop b2, then d6, supporting the pawn on e5 with the d-pawn. However, instead, in the game, Alireza, he's not calling Magnus Carlsen's bluff. He doesn't want to go there yet. Instead, just d6. Now again, he is threatening f takes e5, but he's giving Magnus the option of going e takes f6 or e takes d6 if he wants to maintain the material balance. Now in the game, Magnus does go e takes d6. He could also go bishop b2 or queen e2, continuing to sacrifice the pawn, but that is simply not what he did in this position. All right, e takes d6 on the board, and here Alireza does go bishop takes d6, regaining the pawn immediately. And here Magnus Carlsen, he continues his light squared strategy in this position. He just jumps in with his knight to the c4 square. Knight c4, a very good square for the knight, putting pressure on that bishop on d6. And now where is the bishop going to go? Well, in the game, Alireza does go bishop b7, a perfectly fine move. However, it wasn't completely necessary. Instead, you can also go e5. This was the top engine choice. The idea being if the knight ever takes the bishop on d6, that was a so-called bad bishop. Therefore, knight takes, then queen takes wouldn't be that bad for Alireza. Instead, bishop e7 on the board, a perfectly fine move. And here, Magnus Carlsen, I would have expected here, queen to e2 or bishop b2. Those are the standard moves for this sort of pawn structure for white. However, instead, in the game, Magnus did go g3 here. I think the idea is he was concerned about bishop b2, then knight to f4, allowing Alireza to jump in with the knight, putting pressure on that pawn on g2. However, overall, it wasn't that big of a threat, so g3, just sort of a weakening move on the king side. Now here, Alireza, he does go e5, gaining space in the center, a very strong move, and here white's advantage out of the opening is relatively small. All right, Magnus, bishop b2 on the board, continuing his plan, and Alireza here, what should he be doing? Well, it's actually quite difficult to find the best plan for Alireza here. He has a few different ideas. One, he can expand on the queen side with the move a5. That way, if white ever castles on the queen side, he can threaten a4. Another idea is knight to f8, intending knight to e6, putting the knight on a better square overall. Instead of those here, Alireza does go for a very active idea, bishop g4, putting pressure on that knight on f3. And this move has a hidden threat. Here, if Magnus does not see the threat, for example, let's say he plays queen e2, a typical move again for this structure, then queen d5 would be extremely difficult to deal with. The knight on f3 would be pinned to the queen. Therefore, the only way to defend after queen e2, queen d5 would be knight c d2, retreating the knight to defend the other knight on f3. But overall, that would not be very fun for Magnus. So instead, here in this position, knight to e3 is the move, the only good move for white, putting pressure on the bishop. And where is the bishop going to go here? Of course, you don't want to allow knight takes g4. That would win the bishop, take away black's bishop pair, and ruin his pawn structure on the king side after knight takes, then h takes. Therefore, the bishop has to move back. So, in the game, bishop e6 on the board. Alireza maintains those two b's on e7 and e6. Now Magnus queen to e2, a flexible move, setting up long castles on the queen side if he needs it in the future. Now here Alireza, he is concerned about that long castle idea, therefore he immediately expands on the queen side with the move a5. A very strong move, very typical for this pawn structure, and again, if Magnus castles on the queen side, that would be dubious, as then Alireza would go a4 with the alpha 0 a pawn marching down the board, threatening a takes b3, and opening up the a file for the rook on a8. So instead here, Magnus, he is forced to go a4, blocking down the queen side. However, overall, this does weaken the queen side a little bit. And here, Alireza, he has a wide variety of ideas to increase the pressure. Now, one idea I found with the engine is the insane pawn sacrifice c4. You basically give up the c pawn in order to damage white's pawn structure. Then b takes c4 would not be good. That would open up the b file and weaken the pawn on a4. Instead, d takes c4 would be required, but then you free up the c5 square for the bishop. Bishop c5 would be possible, and again, long castles would not be a legal move as the king would be under check by the queen. So, overall, c4, a very interesting idea. But instead here, Alireza does go queen b6, lining up the queen on the queen side, potentially against the white king if it does long castle. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he doesn't long castle. Instead, knight d2 on the board, a strong move, setting up knight c4 ideas that would hit the queen on b6. Now here, Alireza, he gets out of the attack immediately, queen c7 on the board, and here Magnus finally castles on the queen side. Long castles for Magnus, and here Alireza, king to f7 on the board. He had the option of long castling as well. Instead, he does artificially castle his king on f7, and it is surprisingly safe on the f7 square. And now we are going to have an all-out slugfest here. White castling on the queen side, black artificially castling on the king side. You know what that means. It's going to be both Magnus and Alireza going all out on opposite sides of the board. All right, from here, Magnus, bishop c3, putting pressure on that pawn on a5, a reasonable move. And now Alireza, knight to f8, trying to reroute the knight to a better square, potentially d7 in the future. Now Magnus, rook h to e1, centralizing the rook. All right, from here, Alireza, he continues knight d7, continuing to reroute the knight. However, this move turns out to be slightly dubious, and here Magnus Carlsen, he spots the idea immediately. You know what? If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus here. All of his pieces are perfectly placed. What is he going to do to increase the pressure in this position? And while you're at it, if you like Magnus and Alireza, smash that like button. It helps me out so much. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, Magnus, in this position, he finds a brilliant pawn sacrifice. He goes for on the king side with the move f4. Now, this is a pawn sacrifice, as black can go e takes, g takes, and then queen takes f4, winning the pawn. However, that would be incredibly dangerous. Here, Alireza, he does not take the pawn, and here's why. If you go e takes f4, the move for Magnus Carlsen, believe it or not, it's not g takes f4. Instead, you jump in with the knight to d5, a crazy looking move. The idea being, if black goes c takes d5, taking the knight, then you take the bishop on e6, queen takes d6, and instead if black goes bishop takes d5, then the bishop on e7 is vulnerable. You go queen takes e7. So here, Magnus, f4, an absolutely brilliant move, and I assume he found the right follow-up with knight d5. Instead here, Alireza, he respects Magnus Carlsen's threat. He doesn't take on f4. Instead, knight to b6 is the move here. So Alireza, threatening c4 in certain lines, trying to break up white's pawn structure on the queen side, and for example, if Magnus were to recapture towards the center, b takes c4, then the pawn on the a4 square would hang. So here Alireza, creating some threats on the queen side. All right, now Magnus, he takes on e5, f takes e5 on the board, and here Alireza, he does not like the idea of f takes e5, opening up the king side. Instead here, he actually goes f5, making this a counter pawn sacrifice. Here Alireza sacrificing the pawn on the king side in order to keep all of the lines closed. So very interesting idea. All right, now Magnus Carlsen, knight d to c4, challenging that knight on b6. The threat is potentially knight takes b6, and that would remove one of the attackers on the queen side for Alireza. So what is Alireza going to do? In the game, he does not take on c4. Knight takes c4 would be dubious. Then Magnus could recapture away from the center. D takes c4, and that would open up the d file for him, and he would have an excellent game. Instead here, Alireza, knight d5 on the board, the strongest response by far. And now Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing here? Again, this is a great time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and find the right follow-up for Magnus Carlsen in this position. All right, I hope you found it. The key idea here, believe it or not, is knight to d6, returning the sacrifice pawn. Here you go, knight d6, then bishop takes, d takes, queen takes, and overall that would open up lines in the center. You could follow up, say, knight to c4, and you would have a great game. So knight d6, the key idea here in this position. Instead, Magnus does take on d5. Knight takes d5 on the board, and here Alireza takes back towards the center. C takes d5. Very interesting transformation of the pawn structure. And here Magnus does jump in with the knight to d6 on the board. However, Alireza, he is not forced to take back the knight. For example, bishop takes d6 might be a little bit dubious. The idea being bishop takes, e takes, queen takes, and then here in this position, Magnus Carlsen would have the response, bishop takes g7, deflecting the king away from the defense of the bishop on e7, and if king takes, then queen takes e7, regains the piece, and regains the sacrifice pawn. So, bishop takes overall, not the best idea. Instead, Alireza does go king to g8, just retreating the king. All right, now Magnus Carlsen, d4, expanding in the center, a very strong idea. And now Alireza, what should he be doing? Well, c4 is playable here. However, that leads to insane complications after b takes, d takes, then d5 from Magnus, putting pressure on that bishop on d5, or e6, sorry, and he would have those very strong pawns on d5 and e5. Instead here, Alireza, he plays the very interesting idea, rook to h6, the rook lift on the 6th rank, and now the rook can swing over to the queen side potentially later in the game. So a very creative idea by Alireza here. Now Magnus, d takes c5 on the board, taking the pawn, queen takes c5, regaining the pawn back for Alireza, and now bishop d4, putting pressure on the queen on c5. Where is the queen going to go? Well, it jumps into the a3 square, queen to a3 on the board, hitting the king with check. The bishop does retreat, bishop b2, and in response, Alireza does go back with the queen to the c5 square, queen to c5. And now Magnus Carlsen, if he wanted it, he could go for a draw by repetition with the move bishop d4, queen to a3, bishop b2, queen to c5, and so on. That would be a draw. However, Magnus Carlsen, he's playing for a win here. Instead, he goes queen d2, putting more pressure on that pawn on d5. Now here, Alireza, rook g6 on the board. The rook now putting pressure on that g3 pawn, threatening rook takes g3, and that would be a great development for him. So Magnus, how is he going to defend? In the game, rook to e3 is the move, defending the pawn with the rook. But now Alireza, he has a great opportunity to get some counterplay going on the king side. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea here for Alireza. All right, I hope you found it. The strongest move here, believe it or not, is the pawn sacrifice f4. The idea being if g takes f4, then you fly in with the rook, rook to g2. The idea being you're trying to deflect the queen away from the defense of the rook on e3. So if queen takes g2, then queen takes e3, wins the rook with check, and Alireza would have a very dangerous attack. So overall, f4 would have been a brilliant idea. Instead here, Alireza rook to g4 on the board, putting pressure along the 4th rank. And now there are various rook takes a4 ideas in the air. So interesting idea. Now Magnus, king b1 on the board, and then rook b8 for Alireza. Alireza lining up the rook with the king on b2. And again, there will be various rook takes a4 ideas in the future. Now here, Magnus Carlsen in this position, rook to c3 is the move, putting pressure on the queen on c5. But Alireza, he doesn't mind. Queen b6 is the response. And now the queen and the rook are putting pressure on that king on b2. Things are getting dangerous. For example, rook takes a4 is now the real threat, as if you go b takes a4 in response, then the move, of course, is queen takes b2, and that would be checkmate on the spot. So here, Magnus Carlsen, what should he be doing in response? Well, he has to get counterplay, and he has to get it fast. And the best way to do that is rook to f3, putting pressure on that pawn on f5, and threatening knight takes f5 on the next move. Instead here, Magnus does go rook d3. This move is quite a bit weaker. Maybe he's threatening an exchange sacrifice or a rook sacrifice on d5 with the move rook takes d5. However, here, Alireza, he's not slowing down. Rook takes a4 on the board. And again, the idea being, if b takes a4, that is a blunder. You go queen takes b2, checkmating white on the spot. So here, Magnus, what is he going to do in response? Well, he plays the only move, and he simply sacrifices the rook on d5. Rook takes d5 is the response by Magnus. The idea being if bishop takes, then queen takes, you give up the rook for the bishop and the pawn, but you open up the attack on the black king. The center's being opened up, and you do have counterplay. Now here, Alireza, he does not take the rook on d5 with the bishop. Believe it or not, instead the move is rook to b4, threatening rook takes b3 with the counter rook sacrifice. All right, Magnus Carlsen, he decides to call Alireza's bluff. He goes bishop c3, putting pressure on the rook. Does Alireza have the guts to go rook takes b3 with the counter rook sacrifice? And it turns out the answer is yes. Rook takes b3 on the board, the double rook sacrifice. Magnus takes back with the pawn, c takes b3, then queen takes, hitting the king, then bishop b2. The bishop is being defended by the queen, therefore queen takes b2 is not a possibility yet. And here, instead of bishop takes d5, Alireza actually declines the rook sacrifice. Instead, king to h8 is the move, and this is a very key idea. Instead, if he went bishop takes d5, then the response would have been queen takes d5, hitting both the king on g8 and the queen on b3. Therefore, the queens would come flying off the board, and that would not be good for Alireza. Alireza has to maintain the attacking chances here. Therefore, king to h8 is the only way to keep the attack going with the queens on the board. Now here, Magnus, Rook takes a5 is the move, winning the free pawn on the a5 square. However, this move was not the strongest, and here Alireza gets counterplay on the king side with the move f4. Alireza attacking on all sides of the board. Of course, he did miss the idea of simply queen takes g3. That would have been a little bit stronger, but instead f4 on the board. Now Magnus does take on f4, g takes f4 on the board, and the idea of this move, f4 by Alireza, it did open up these lines of attack with the bishops, and beyond that, that pawn on h4 is now hanging. If Alireza wins the pawn on h4, then h5, h4, h3, h2, h1 promoting would be a threat in the future. Now here, Alireza, bishop d8, putting pressure on the rook on a5. Where is the rook going to go? Rook to a6 is the move, but now bishop g4, putting pressure on the other rook on d1. Now rook c1 is the move, and finally bishop takes h4, wins the pawn on h4. Alireza officially has the passed pawn on h5, and that pawn will be very important throughout this game. All right, queen c2, offering the queen trade. And of course, Alireza is attacking here. Of course, he declines. Instead, queen d5 on the board. Now rook c6, lining up all the major pieces on the c file. The threat now, rook to c8, trying to trade off a pair of rooks here. So Alireza, bishop g3 on the board, putting pressure on that pawn on f4. And now instead of rook c8, Magnus does go queen to c4, once again offering the queen trade. And once again, Alireza does decline. Queen g2 on the board. However, this move is a big mistake. Instead, it turns out you have to take the queen on c4. Queen takes c4 was the only move, and you would have counterplay based on that passed pawn on the h-file. And as you can see by the eval par, things are not looking good for Alireza here. And it turns out Magnus Carlsen has a forced checkmate in 6 moves. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find Magnus Carlsen's mate in 6 moves here. It is incredible. All right, I hope you found it. And by the way, Magnus did find it in the game. The GOAT found it in time pressure, only 42 seconds left on the clock. Here we go. The first move is knight to f7, hitting the king with check. Where is the king going to go? King g8 is the best move here. It delays the inevitable the longest. However, now you do have those discovered attacks with the knight, and knight g5 is the move, hitting the king. The king cannot go to h7 as the knight controls that. Therefore, king h8 and king f8 are the only moves. In the game, king h8, and now we have rook c8, hitting the king and forcing the rooks off the board. Now, bishop takes, then queen takes c8, rook takes c8, and finally the finishing blow, rook takes c8, the rook and the knight deliver the checkmate. The king has nowhere to go. Wow, what a finish by Magnus Carlsen. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Magnus plays an absolutely unthinkable rook sacrifice against Alireza Firouzja in his French defense opening. That game was insane. I'm sure you're going to love it, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.